My brother generously invited us to stay at his home without charging us for rent or utilities. I handle finances for a living, and my husband, Stephen, is a mechanic. We reside in the house where I was raised, a property that holds a special place in my family's history. Originally, it served as the headquarters for my father's business. It was anticipated that my brother would take over the family business, prompting him to pursue a degree in economics, including further studies at Oxford University. After gaining substantial knowledge there, he returned to New York, U.S., and joined my father in running the business. When our parents decided to retire and relocate, they handed the business to my brother and gifted me the house. Stephen and I chose to make it our home. Conveniently located near public transportation, shops, hospitals, and schools, the house is ideally situated. It suits our current needs perfectly and will continue to do so even after our children move out. We feel profoundly grateful to my parents for this gift, and we were looking forward to our future in this home. However, not long after settling in, our peace was disrupted by frequent visits from my mother-in-law. She often inquired about my parents' finances, given their history as business owners. Her questions like, "Angela, how much money do your parents have?" and "What will you inherit when they pass?" made me uncomfortable. I tried to deflect her curiosity by saying that I hadn't given it much thought and that the house might be the extent of any inheritance. Despite my attempts to dismiss the topic, she persisted, insinuating that my parents must have discussed their financial plans with me. Her interest seemed rooted in expectations of gaining something from their wealth, even though I was clear about what I would inherit. This situation created an unexpected tension and made me uneasy about her motives. I chose not to share my concerns with my husband, who is particularly close to his mother, hoping to avoid any further complications. However, an utterly unexpected event unfolded that completely took me by surprise. It was a holiday morning, just about 7 a.m. when our doorbell rang unexpectedly. Upon opening the door, I was greeted by a mover, which left me both shocked and confused. Before I could gather my thoughts, my mother-in-law, along with my brother-in-law's family, arrived announcing they were moving in. The smirks on their faces sent a chill through me. My husband, awakening to the commotion, seemed undisturbed by the situation. When I questioned him, he simply asked, "What's the problem?" He pointed out that our house had plenty of space for everyone, as if it were perfectly normal for them to just move in. The surprises kept coming when my sister-in-law declared that they had been invited by my brother. She explained cheerfully that they wouldn't need to pay for rent or utilities and were looking forward to our hospitality. Meanwhile, my brother-in-law began to intrusively inspect the rooms, deciding aloud which he preferred based on the sunlight, and instructing Stephen to clear out our belongings. As this surreal scenario unfolded, I felt a sense of vertigo from the shock. This was our home, yet they were behaving as if they owned the place, opening doors and staking claims to rooms. My mother-in-law and sister-in-law had been quite overbearing for some time, with my sister-in-law even rummaging through my bag without permission on previous occasions. Their audacious behavior continued to encroach on my personal space, and my patience wore thin. This was the last straw. Frustrated and assertive, I finally stood my ground. "This is my house," I declared. "Why are you acting as if you own it? I've had enough. I want everyone to leave." The time had come to reclaim my space and restore peace to our home. I'm usually quite composed and not one to raise my voice, but watching these people take over the house my parents had entrusted to me, acting as if they owned it, pushed me to my limits. That's why I lost my temper and shouted at all three of them. However, the situation escalated unexpectedly when one of them retorted, "How dare you talk to us like that? You're the one who should leave." Shortly after, I felt a sharp sting on my cheek. It took me a moment to realize I had been slapped. I was in shock, my cheek throbbing painfully. In that instant, something inside me just broke. Living with people capable of such disrespect was unthinkable. But this house was mine, and I wouldn't let them treat it like a free hostel. So, I made the difficult decision to leave temporarily. I quickly packed some essentials and found a monthly rental apartment to stay in for the time being. This meant I would have to commute to work, but it seemed the only viable option at that moment. Once settled, I called my parents to explain the ordeal. Even through the phone, I could feel their outrage. My father, who has always balanced his roles as a strict CEO and a loving father brilliantly, was particularly upset. I hated bringing them into this mess, especially just as they were enjoying their retirement, but I was left with no choice as my rightful home was being encroached upon. While I was adjusting to life in the rental apartment, I was certain that my husband and his family were getting comfortable in my house. Motivated by suggestions from my brother and father, I decided it was time to take further action. A few days later, during a break at work, I checked my phone and saw dozens of missed calls and messages from my husband. I knew exactly why he was trying to reach me. It was time to address this situation head on. But this time, I would be prepared and not alone in my fight to reclaim what was rightfully mine. In response to the untenable situation at home, I decided to take a firm step by contacting the utility companies to disconnect the electricity and water services to the house. Our home is entirely dependent on electricity. Without it, nothing functions. We hadn't installed solar panels yet, so there was no alternative power source. Given the current heat wave, I imagine living without these basic amenities would be quite difficult. This action likely prompted the flurry of calls from my husband, who was probably trying to manage the sudden lack of utilities. Just as I was about to dismiss another call from him, he rang again during my break. "Hey, what's going on? There's no power and the water isn't running. Did you cut off the electricity and water?" His voice was tinged with panic. I felt that since the house was mine and I was no longer living there, it didn't make sense to continue paying for utilities I wasn't using. The house belongs to me, and now that I'm not there, it wouldn't be sensible to keep the electricity and water running, I explained. Keeping these services active would mean I'd have to cover the bills, which didn't seem fair under the circumstances. When I shared my reasoning, my husband became very upset and demanded that I turn the services back on immediately. However, just because he wanted them reinstated didn't mean I was obliged to comply. I told him, if they want the utilities back, they should pay for them themselves. Every time we discussed finances, they insisted that since it was my house, I should bear the costs, but their actions spoke differently. I had no intention of renewing the utility contracts or asking them to vacate the house immediately. After making my stance clear, I ended the call as my break was finishing. Later, my mother-in-law, sister-in-law, and brother-in-law all reached out with similar requests, complaining about the unbearable heat and inconvenience caused by the lack of water. They wanted me to reconnect the utilities, but my decision was firm. This was a matter of principle and a step towards asserting my boundaries within my property. After hearing their complaints, I firmly told them to handle the situation themselves and hung up the phone. I suspected they were just being opportunistic, hoping I would cave and they could continue living comfortably at my expense. However, even after a week, there was no sign of them leaving. Realizing I needed to take more decisive action, I consulted with a lawyer from my father's company. I explained the situation and requested that he send a formal notice to my husband, accusing them of trespassing. They had entered and occupied my house without permission, essentially forcing me out and treating it as their own. I made it clear in the notice that I was seriously considering legal action. This move shocked my husband, who, surprised and anxious about the legal implications, approached me hoping to find a resolution. Aware of their concern for their social reputation, I knew the threat of a lawsuit would be a significant stressor for them. Despite their desire to maintain their lifestyle, they were now caught in a dilemma between facing legal consequences and convincing me to let them stay. I could see through my husband's intentions clearly, but I refused to listen to their pleas and did not relent to his requests. In a moment of frustration, my husband exploded in anger during a call at his workplace, demanding that I drop the lawyer and accusing me of acting self-righteous. Despite his loud outburst, I remained calm and unaffected, simply annoyed by his audacity to claim rights over my property. No matter how much he protested, my stance was firm. If they continued to squat in my house, legal action was inevitable. I ended the call, feeling that engaging further would be a waste of time. I had already discussed potential divorce proceedings with my lawyer. Upon returning home later, I found missed calls from my mother-in-law and sister-in-law, but decided not to engage further and blocked their numbers to avoid any more disruptions. The threat of legal action and the looming possibility of a lawsuit proved too much for my husband's prideful family. Realizing their position was indefensible, they packed their bags and left the house. With the lawyer's assistance, the divorce negotiations proceeded smoothly. I arranged for a professional cleaning service to refresh the house. Finally, after living separately in a monthly rental, nothing compared to the comfort of returning to my own, now sparkling clean home. The peace and autonomy I regained made all the efforts worthwhile, reaffirming my decision to stand up for my rights and reclaim my space. After moving back into my house, I realized it needed some updates and repairs in several areas. I discussed this with my father, who connected me with a trustworthy contractor. We started planning the renovations, which was an exciting project that marked a new beginning in my comfortably solitary life. Living alone brought a sense of freedom that was both exhilarating and soothing. I could relax on my sofa without critique, eat whatever I fancied without comments, and just enjoy the peace. However, this tranquility was interrupted when I started receiving calls from an unknown number, 5 months into my newfound solitude. Initially, I assumed it was the contractor and ignored the calls, but they kept coming. Eventually, I answered, only to discover it was my ex-husband, whom I had recently divorced with a strict agreement brokered by our lawyers to never contact each other again. Confused and annoyed by his breach of our agreement, especially since he had changed his number to make this call, I demanded to know why he was contacting me. Ignoring my questions, he pleaded desperately for me to listen. Despite my reluctance, he proceeded to explain his situation. His company was undergoing a severe financial crisis, resulting in a significant salary cut. Additionally, his mother's health was deteriorating, making her unable to work, and his sister-in-law and her husband were also in a financial bind due to unstable employment. Most of her earnings were being used to cover her husband's debts. With the salary reduction, my ex-husband and his family were struggling severely to make ends meet. Hearing all this did little to stir my empathy. The memories of how they had forcefully barged into my home, assumed control without my permission, and even attempted to push me out were still fresh. Their previous actions, filled with disregard and disrespect, made it hard for me to feel anything but disbelief at their current plight. I told him that his current difficulties were his to manage and reminded him of our legal agreement to cease contact. As I ended the call, all I could think was how unbelievable it was that people who had treated me so poorly expected any sympathy or help from me now. I listened, devoid of sympathy, as my ex-husband described their dire circumstances. "We're in serious trouble. We might not be able to pay our rent or even buy food tomorrow. We used to be a family, right? Please help us," he pleaded, his voice breaking with emotion. Yet his words did nothing to sway my resolve. I remembered all too well my struggles and how, when I needed support, he did nothing to help. He, along with my mother-in-law, had always looked down on me. My sister-in-law and brother-in-law joined in too, mocking my appearance and my traditional views without a care for my feelings. My mother-in-law not only exacerbated situations, but also pressured me relentlessly to have a child, pushing herbal concoctions on me, booking unnecessary medical appointments, and even spreading harmful rumors among our neighbors about my ability to conceive. Reflecting on these memories, it was clear there was not a single redeeming period in my marriage. Once kind and supportive, my ex-husband had transformed into a mere puppet under his mother's influence post-wedding. I recalled a particularly vivid incident where, returning from an appointment, I learned my mother-in-law had visited our home, cried to my husband about wanting to befriend me, but then slandered me at every opportunity. Whether at home or in public, my sister-in-law and brother-in-law would ridicule me, laughing cruelly at my expense. With such a past, how could I entertain the idea of helping them now? No matter what you say, my feelings remain unchanged. I cannot help you, I asserted firmly. I was resolute not to allow their current plight to drag me back into a cycle of manipulation and disrespect. I'm going to hang up now and please never contact me again. With that, I ended the call and immediately blocked the new number. Knowing my ex-husband's persistence, he might try to change his number and reach out again, but I was prepared to maintain my boundaries firmly shut against any further attempts from him or his family to draw me back into their troubles. Over the weekend, I planned to change my phone number at the store to avoid further harassment, but before I could do so, my ex-husband and his family broke the agreement established through our lawyers. Unexpectedly, they showed up at my house around 10 p.m., banging on the door and yelling, "Open up! Let us in and take care of us. We're family. You should help us." Their loud voices disrupted the peaceful night without any regard for the late hour or the disturbance they were causing the neighbors. Rather than confront them directly, I attempted to communicate through the intercom, urging them to go home and stop causing a scene. However, they ignored my pleas and continued to bang on the door, creating quite a commotion. Overwhelmed by their reckless behavior, I was on the verge of calling the police when I heard sirens approaching. It turned out a neighbor had already alerted the authorities. Seeing the police, my ex-husband and his companions panicked, mistakenly thinking I had called the officers. They tried to flee, but with a crowd of onlookers gathered, escape was not an option. The police swiftly intervened, escorting them to the station. I provided a full account of the events to the police, explaining the situation and their unwarranted intrusion. The incident quickly became the talk of the neighborhood, and word spread even to my ex-husband's workplace through a coworker who witnessed the scene. Already facing financial difficulties due to a salary cut, the public ordeal and police involvement were the final blows to his professional life. His employer decided to let him go. With no job and unable to afford his apartment rent, tensions escalated within his family, leading to the collapse of their shared living arrangement. My ex-husband, Stephen, along with his mother, now resides in public housing. Both are working multiple part-time jobs, striving to make ends meet, with even his mother eager to contribute financially to their reduced circumstances.